Well, hello and welcome to this latest TRL webinar, where this month we're looking at using technology to understand the causes behind road collisions. But not all road collisions in this case, but how TRL has worked with the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, on a vital project. Now, the UNHCR is the refugee agency which undertakes vital work protecting vulnerable people forced to flee their homes. It delivers life-saving assistance in emergencies, it's safeguarding fundamental human rights and helping find long-term solutions for people so they can find a safe place to call home. Now, to keep the UNHCR teams working around the clock around the world, they need transport, and the organisation operates a fleet of around 10,000 vehicles. This fleet includes everything from motorcycles to armoured trucks, all sizes, shapes, makes, models and ages, and they cover thousands of miles a year, often in remote and inhospitable areas. Now, road crashes pose a significant threat to the health and safety of the personnel, their partners, their persons of concern, and the local communities in which they operate. So understanding the causal and contributory factors in collisions involving their vehicles has been a key focus for UNHCR. And today we're going to learn how TRL is supporting UNHCR across the globe with independent and impartial investigation of collisions involving their vehicles and the results the work has delivered so far, and as well as what it means for other organisations in how the lessons learned can be used to reduce your risk as well. So let's welcome our guests today. Carlos Gomez-Shedden is Senior Road Safety Coordinator from the UNHCR's Road Safety Unit, and Craig Arnold is TRL's UN Technical Lead. Now, before we hand over to our guests, one more thing from me. Don't forget, this is an interactive webinar, so if you've got any questions, please pop them into the Q&A tab, which is on your Zoom screen. On mine, it's at the bottom. Yours might be at the top, but you'll find it at the Q&A screen, and we'll come to your questions after we've heard from our guests. So let's start with Craig. Craig, I outlined the background to the UNHCR, but please explain to me why they need a bespoke solution.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, so essentially UNHCR, as you say, operate around the globe, and they've got huge fleet of 10,000 vehicles. Part of their mission is helping in the region of 110 million people, and they operate in over 110 countries. So this is not a small operation by any means. It's a huge logistical and transport operation operating across the globe. There are vast numbers of people involved, both UNHCR staff and also the refugees and other people that UNHCR assist. Now, the fleet is quite interesting and quite unique in some respects. And I say that because they have a fleet of vehicles they operate, which are operated to a greater degree by partner agencies than themselves. So the reason for that is because the operational environment in which UNHCR operate in, they work collaboratively with various partners, and they do that to help people on the ground. And to assist with this, often UNHCR provide the vehicles and then partner agencies operate them. Now, this goes back probably a couple of years, but UNHCR identified that there were an increasing number of collisions involving their vehicles. And so, as Paul said at the start of this talk, this represents a huge risk to UNHCR, and it can affect their ability to support who are very vulnerable people around the world. And so they wanted to really understand what that meant and actually to get a grip of it. Their aim was to put in place some mitigations to either reduce the number of crashes, or if you can't reduce the number of crashes, reduce the severity of them. So at least if you're having crashes, they are not quite as severe as maybe they could have been, but for some of the circumstances. Now, ultimately, the aim is to have no collisions, but with a fleet of that size, we could probably debate how likely that is, and that's probably a discussion for another day. But nevertheless, it's still vital, I would say, to understand exactly what the problems are and to try and understand what areas we should focus our attention to try and reduce those number of crashes. So the aim for TRL was to understand UNHCR's problem, determine the root causes of crashes, and make some recommendations to them about how to best prevent them from happening again. Now, part of this involves a combination of desktop analysis and also in-country visits. So staff flying out to these locations around the world to collect data from the crash scenes. Now, it is important to understand, I'll give an example a little later, the operational environment is extremely difficult for UNHCR. They are not operating often in countries that are stable. There may be civil war, there can be tanks driving around, a whole host of uncertain events can occur, and so the environment for them is extremely difficult. So, how do we provide a solution? Well, what we do is basically we provide our investigations. We're also providing ongoing research and analysis of collisions, and also supporting UNHCR by building capabilities to enable them to collect really good crash data for themselves in the future as well. So how do we go about understanding the problems and root causes? Well, essentially that's through forensic investigations. So the service we provide to UNHCR involves every strand of TRL, from our software and consulting teams right through to our investigations and data teams. Now, the investigations themselves are carried out by specialists from within two of our teams within TRL, our forensic investigations team and also our collision data services team. Expertise of TRL, which I'm sure, as many on this call will know, go right across the kind of spectrum of transport, from developing fleet management processes to decarbonisation and autonomous vehicles, quality testing, software, collision investigation. And really, we've drawn on that wide range of options within TRL for this service. And I think actually the diverse expertise within TRL is what has allowed us to take on some of the challenges that investigating collisions in really quite remote and challenging locations around the globe can bring up. Now, there are a few examples on screen of some of the skills within our teams, and we use lots of these when investigating collisions with UNHCRs. But what specifically are we looking for? Well, frankly, anything. And I go back a few years when I had a junior investigator who was shadowing me at a road crash, and I was examining the road surface really closely. And I remember the guy asked me what I was looking for. And it was one of the moments where I honestly couldn't answer him. I didn't have an answer of what I was looking for. And I recall telling him that I didn't know, but I would when I saw it. And it sounds incredible to say that, but that in some respects goes to the heart of how investigations need to be approached. If you enter an investigation with a closed mind, invariably you're going to miss something. And the old phrase that is taught to detectives is assume nothing, believe nobody, challenge everything. And actually, I think that is a really good way to approach investigations. So as the slide shows here, we don't really care about the type of evidence. We just want to receive some evidence. And often with collisions involving UNHCR vehicles, we're using a combination of scene information. So that could be photographs from the scene. It might be data on the road layout, satellite imagery. Effectively, it can be anything to do with the scene. We also use telematics and digital data from their fleet tracking systems. And we also rely on injury information. Now, by bringing all of that together, this kind of web you see on screen allows us to put together our version of what is going to be the most accurate reconstruction of that event. But we do have to keep a very open mind, even more so than maybe we would in more developed countries, because the type of evidence available may be more limited. And I'll discuss a little later about some of the challenges in terms of getting access to data that we've actually had to come across. So one example of this was back in 2023. We were informed by Carlos of a collision in Turkey during the recent earthquake. So you may cast your minds back when there was a quite severe earthquake in southern Turkey. UNHCR had staff on the ground and were providing what was essentially very vital support to those who were affected. But unfortunately, one of the vehicles was involved in quite a serious collision. Now, I won't go into the circumstances of that on this call, but the collision was such that it was the type we would want to have gone out, examine the scene and carry out some investigations to understand exactly how the collision occurred. The problem was that the circumstances on the ground were extremely challenging. The earthquake had just happened. There was very little logistical support available in the country. And to enable UNHCR to support either TRL people to go out or even UNHCR's internal road safety team would potentially have meant affecting their ability to provide services to people who needed them in those really difficult circumstances. So we discussed this between ourselves and UNHCR, and we decided that attending the scene was probably not the best way to approach this specific collision, and we had to think of another option. Now, in the end, we were able to do that through internal discussions with the UNHCR staff who were on the ground and give them some idea of the type of information we would want to collect to enable us to investigate. That was provided to us, and in the end, we were able to produce a reasonably detailed investigation report into the circumstances. Now, that is one particularly good example of how UNHCR operate in difficult situations and have to balance priorities, because let's be honest, UNHCR's priority is refugees, and it should be. It should be supporting those people that are in quite dire circumstances and trying to get the best outcome for them. That has to be UNHCR's priority, and I would agree with that. And I think it shows that UNHCR are taking road safety seriously. It's showing really leadership in road safety by being transparent and allowing what is an independent organisation to come in and take a look at their crashes and understand what's going on. But obviously the focus has to be on refugees and all the other people that they support. And I think Turkey shows how UNHCR, with support from TRL, were able to strike that balance really well, and hopefully that continues going forward. But as with any investigation, an investigation helps us define a problem. It doesn't solve the problem. And so how do we solve problems or the problems posed by road crashes? Well, essentially by considering specific aspects and elements of that collision and kind of tackling each in turn. You kind of have to be methodical all the way through to try and understand how a collision could have been prevented. Now, this is not as simple as just looking at the crash itself. You have to look at the lead up to the collision, a term what we phrase the pre-collision phase. You also have to look at the collision itself, what actually happened, how did the crash occur, who hit who, in what order, and all of those kinds of questions arise inevitably. But you also have to look at the post-collision phase. Now, I'll give a kind of grossly oversimplified example, but if we imagine a driver losing control on a bend, right-hand bend, for example, driver approaches the bend, loses control, crashes, and goes off the road. If you look at that in isolation, you may say, well, okay, the bend potentially is too tight. Was the driver approaching too quickly? But when you look at that more holistically, you could discover things like a few minutes before the crash, the driver was using a mobile phone. And so you say to yourself, okay, but they weren't using the mobile phone at the time of the crash. Well, correct. But we know from research that distraction from mobile phones can last up to 5 minutes after a call has ended. So we accept, okay, maybe the driver wasn't on their phone right before the crash, but if it was in that 5-minute window before, did that play a part? And so we have to think about that and consider the interaction of these kinds of things. That's just one very simple example. There are more. Equally, were injuries more severe because there were no medical facilities nearby? Was the local hospital 4, 5, 6 hours down the road? And if so, you only know that by looking at what happened after the crash. If we stop investigating when the cars or the vehicles hit each other, we lose all of that post-crash information that actually says it took the driver a long time to get to the hospital and that resulted in worse outcomes for them. So we really do have to look at the whole thing from the start to the very end. And at the end, who knows where the end is? Invariably, it's when they arrive at hospital, but it may not be. And often there is a focus when people are investigating on the crash itself. You know, what was the driver doing? Well, okay, maybe they were doing something wrong. Maybe they weren't. But if you keep a focus on that collision phase, you will potentially miss some really important information that helps you understand the root cause. And that was what our investigations service continues to be with UNHCR, is getting to that root cause of crashes. So a little more specific then, what did we find when we looked at UNHCR collisions? Well, we saw most collisions involve some level of injury. As you can see on screen, 74% of all the collisions involving UNHCR vehicles had some level of injury. To a lesser degree, fatalities and total loss, which is vehicles that are damaged beyond repair, but still 15% of collisions are fatal. Now, there will be and should be an inevitable focus on fatal collisions, but there are occasions where, but for some really minor aspect, a minor injury collision could have been a fatal collision. And so I say this regularly, a fatal collision requires detailed investigation. Yes, absolutely. But equally, there is lots of learning that can come out of less serious collisions, which may have been fatal, but for some other really small aspect. On another day, in another area, involving another driver, it could have been fatal. And so it's important to focus on those as well. And that's where our analysis comes in. We do our investigations, we produce our investigative reports, but then after we've done all of that, we analyse each of these collisions to understand exactly what the causal and contributory factors are that led to each of these crashes occurring, and what things we could do to make them less severe or less numerous in future. So we also need to look at geographical information, because obviously, as you will imagine, UNHCR operates around the globe, over 110 countries, as I said earlier. And we see that where they're occurring most likely, you can see on this map, those countries highlighted in red, kind of tend to be around the equatorial band of Africa. And those representing 5% of crashes or that kind of area are shown in amber. And those in green have only a small number of collisions, but are still represented in the data to some degree. Guatemala over on the left there and Bangladesh are kind of difficult to see on that map. But other than those countries, it generally tends to be around Africa and the Middle East. The only European country represented in the data is Ukraine. There was only one crash there. So perhaps the obvious question is, okay, are these collisions just occurring where UNHCR have got more vehicles? Well, yes, but that's not the whole picture. And so we see on this slide, if we look at Asia Pacific with the green arrow there at the top, they have 15% of UNHCR vehicles within Asia Pacific, yet only 1% of collisions are occurring there. Conversely, if we look at the bottom example of Eastern Horn of Africa, only 32% of UNHCR vehicles are there, but they represent 58% of the collisions. So you can see there are some areas that are disproportionately represented in the data. And so we move to causes. Well, as is common, inappropriate and excessive speed is a big one. And I'll not talk too much on this slide because I know Carlos is going to discuss this in greater detail. But inappropriate and excessive speeds, poor road condition, hazard perception tend to be the main reason behind why most of these collisions are occurring. We also see that around 70% of collisions involve a vulnerable road user, 50% involve motorcyclists, and 20% of collisions involve pedestrians. So huge number of vulnerable road users involved. And that really leads on to the next slide, I guess, which talks about some of the focus areas we found when looking at these collisions. One of them was around bull bar fitment. We found that where bull bars were fitted to UNHCR vehicles, 62% of those collisions with vehicles fitted with bull bars contributed to a higher level of injury. And Carlos will discuss what they did, how they kind of put these insights into action on the next slide. But another aspect I wanted to highlight from this particular slide is high-risk driving and drivers. There is definitely an issue around high-risk drivers. We had one driver over a 12-month period who was involved in 4 fatal or serious collisions. Some other drivers were involved in 3, and there were multiple drivers involved in more than 1 collision. Now, there can be numerous factors of that, and our ongoing research is looking into that more closely. It's often not, those headline figures don't often tell you the full picture, but it was certainly a cause for concern and something that UNHCR wanted to look into more. So they were 2 of the examples we looked at in more detail. Convoy operations and ambulance operations, we were also asked to look at. UNHCR operate lots of convoys. We found actually convoys weren't disproportionately represented in the data. It was no more likely to be involved in a crash when you're in a convoy than operating normally. And so what were some of the challenges? Well, invariably, some of the challenges are getting access to data. It can be extremely limited on the ground, but we work with UNHCR really well to get what we can in order to carry out the investigations that we need to. Now, on this screen are some of the challenges faced with any large fleet operator. Not all of these are necessarily specific to UNHCR, although a couple of them are. The positive thing, or an extremely positive thing, I would say, from UNHCR's perspective, is that they have management buy-in and organisational buy-in. That is often missing in some of these projects and services, that often management aren't really on board with wanting to reduce collisions to any significant degree, kind of plastering over the cracks is the term I would use. But that's not what's going on in UNHCR. There is really strong management buy-in. And I think we can see that by some of the investigations we have been selected to get involved in. Lots of organisations maybe wouldn't feel as comfortable opening the doors in the way that UNHCR have. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Carlos, who we work with quite regularly, and he will discuss how we are putting some of these insights that we generated into action. Carlos?
It was a very good explanation of the work that we started doing with TRL. So Craig was explaining that this job is very important for us, for understanding the causes of the traffic crashes. And he was explaining that there are some limitations for getting the information that we need in order to proceed with investigations. And in relation to the limitations, I also want to explain that when we started working, or at least when I started working with UNHCR with my colleague Chaba, who is my right hand in the road safety unit, we identified many gaps in the road safety management system in the organization. And we were trying to close those gaps, and we were finding barriers and barriers and barriers. And one of the reasons, because there could be many reasons of the barriers, but one of the reasons is that sometimes the understanding of road safety is very simplistic. For many people, you solve road safety problems with training and awareness, and that's it. So in a context where most people misunderstand road safety is equivalent to driver's training, powerful information really becomes a tool to change minds. Because it's very difficult when we try to do some change within the organization, because sometimes these changes also involve the works of other colleagues. And at the same time, people that could have more power than us, they kind of try to limit our work to training and awareness. So once we started getting the information of the root causes of the traffic crashes, then we started breaking these barriers very easily. Or well, maybe not that easily, but it became easier to break some of these barriers. So examples of barriers: lack of understanding of the complexity of road safety, as I was mentioning. There is also some reluctance to do some changes, especially when our work interferes with somebody else's work. And sometimes there were some priorities that were established based on some myths. And this is where the information that we got, especially from the annual report, because I don't know if Craig explained this, TRL produces a report for every type of investigation that we request them to analyze or to conduct. I mean, we ask TRL to conduct the investigations of fatal crashes, non-fatal injury crashes, and total losses. There are other crashes, minor crashes, that we don't send those to TRL. We focus on those three. And TRL produces a report for each type of investigation, but then at the end, they conduct an annual report where we can see the overall picture of what is happening in the organization. And then with that information, we started breaking some barriers and challenging some of the myths that were interfering with the priorities established in terms of road safety. So for instance, myth number one, we need bull bars to protect our colleagues in the case of vehicle-to-animal collisions. So for that reason, especially in the African region, many vehicles, it was over 45% of our vehicles, were equipped with bull bars. And when I started working with UNHCR, we started this discussion. And this was back to 2021. We started the discussion of bull bars, and people were defending bull bars a lot. So we were wondering, what is the percentage of traffic crashes with injuries and fatalities involving animals? And well, this is a very low portion. It's a really, really low portion. In 2022, it was just 1% of our collisions. Collisions, the most severe ones, were involving animals. But still, people were defending bull bars. However, when we got some preliminary data, this is the final data, but we didn't need to wait until finalizing the annual report. With some preliminary data, I showed this to one of the decision makers. This is the contribution of bull bars to the fatal traffic crashes and to the injury traffic crashes. When this decision maker saw this graph, he made the decision. We are going to stop the provision of bull bars from the headquarters, because what was happening is that the headquarters buy the vehicles and distribute the vehicles to operations, and operations can select some of the characteristics of the vehicles. And in Africa, one of those preferred characteristics are the bull bars. So UNHCR became more responsible in terms of this, because most of our traffic crashes were involving vulnerable road users, and having vehicles equipped with bull bars really increases the likelihood of fatal crashes and injury crashes. So fortunately, this decision maker said, we are not going to provide bull bars anymore to operations. So now we are in the process for making some changes in our regulations to make forbidden the installation of bull bars, because we need to go through steps. The first step is the headquarters are not providing bull bars anymore. Good. Unfortunately, still in operations, they could install bull bars in the vehicles if they want. And then this could be a problem, because the bull bars might not be compatible with some of the safety features of the vehicles if they do that in their countries. And just as an example, some of my colleagues some years ago went to inspect some vehicles to one country, and they found a very handmade bull bar installed in one of our vehicles. The vehicle was called Mad Max, because it was this piece of metal installed in front of the vehicle that wasn't not only a danger for the other road users, but also for the colleagues who using the vehicles, because this structure is not compatible with the characteristics of the vehicles. And therefore, we need to continue improving our regulations, but this is a process that we are conducting. Then, as Craig mentioned, most of our vehicles are given to partner organizations. So some people say partner organization drivers are found more frequently in traffic crashes with casualties, but this is just because most of the vehicles are given to partner organizations. So this is normal. This is partially true. Obviously, the more vehicles they have, then the higher the exposure to risk. Then there is another concept that sometimes when I try to introduce it from the road safety perspective, it's a little difficult, because people don't see clearly what is the relation of carpooling with road safety. They kind of don't see it, and I need to explain it, but still it's a little difficult to implement carpooling, especially for partner organizations. So this is the distribution of crashes per custodian. So as it's indicated in the first myth, yes, most of the crashes are involving partner organization drivers. And this could be related to the distribution of the vehicles among operations. Most of the vehicles are with partner organization drivers. However, when we compare this information, which road user was found at fault of traffic crashes? we see that when it comes to identify who was at fault, and I want to clarify here something. The investigations are not meant to blame anybody. We are not using the investigations for punishing anybody or for blaming anybody. However, it's still important to see this piece of information in order to see some differences of the behaviors of the road users. So fortunately, when we see this graph, we see that UNHCR drivers are found at fault in the lowest proportion in comparison to third parties and in comparison to partner drivers. Partner drivers represented 55% of the collisions in which the driver of the UNHCR vehicle was found at fault. And this is a very big difference in terms of behavior. So yes, it is partially because most of the vehicles are given to partner organization drivers, but we have an issue with behavior too that we need to approach. And approaching UNHCR drivers and partner drivers require different mechanisms. Why I was mentioning carpooling here, because the less kilometers are traveled, when people are sharing the rides, we reduce the number of kilometers driven. And that means that there is less exposure to risk. So if you can fit 4 people in a vehicle, instead of having 4 different vehicles traveling around, you reduce the risk of collisions. But also, when you have more control over the partners or over the driver's behaviors, I mean, then it's easier to reduce the risk of collisions related to the behavior of the driver. So if we reduce the number of vehicles given to partner organizations by implementing carpooling within partner organizations, which is something that started happening this year, it is not just that we reduce exposure to risk by reducing the number of kilometers driven, but we also reduce the number of drivers that we need to pay attention to, and then we can control their behaviors easily or easier. So that's why I wanted to point this out, because we are starting to do this. Road safety hasn't been involved yet in the process. As I mentioned, people don't see it that related, but I do. But at some point, the road safety unit is going to get involved in this process. Most traffic crashes are attributed to human error. So traffic crash problems can be solved by providing training. This is, as I mentioned, sometimes people's understanding of road safety is very simplistic, and they want training for drivers and awareness for drivers, and basically that's when people approach the road safety unit looking for help, that's basically the type of requests we get. But when we see this chart, most of the crashes were related to excess of a speed or inappropriate speed. And when it comes to speed management, training is not the solution. Why it is not the solution? Because training, whatever concept you teach to people, it becomes a decision. So, and you can ask people, have you ever driven your vehicle over the speed limit? And most people are going to say, yes, we have done it. And I do it very frequently. For instance, they could say, yeah, I do it every day. And I don't see the issue because I haven't had any collision. So when you try to approach speeding issues by training, you're kind of wasting your time. For managing speeds, you need other types of controls. And this is related to how we could use our vehicle tracking system, for instance, in order to monitor traveling speeds. So, and basically, this has became one of the main targets within our projects, speed management. We have little control over the characteristics of the roads. And the poor road surface conditions is the second root cause that was identified in our traffic crashes, as a contributing factor of our traffic crashes, I mean. But UNHCR has little control over this. We don't build the roads where we operate. Sometimes we could do some little modifications. Like, for instance, I remember that there was a place in Ethiopia where our colleagues installed some speed bumps, but it's quite limited what we can do in relation to road surface. However, if we manage to reduce the traveling speeds, this even helps reducing risks related to poor road surface conditions. Because when you reduce traveling speeds, you give more time to the driver to react to whatever stimulus is finding. It could be a hazard that the driver identifies. So the driver, when the driver identifies a hazard, is going to have more time to react and to proceed with a braking maneuver or an evasive maneuver. We don't know what it could be, it depends on each circumstance. But reducing speed is always going to give more time to the driver to react. And then the vehicle is going to, or the vehicle braking system is going to need to dissipate less energy to stop the vehicle. So when you combine these two things, more time to react, less effort to stop the vehicle, then you reduce the risk of traffic crashes, even if this risk of traffic crash is related to a hazard that is related to the road conditions. Then when it comes to hazard perception, the road safety unit had some ideas about it, but it wasn't as specific as hazard perception. We were trying to improve the way that we interact with other road users. But this hazard perception is still even more focused. So this means that if, in this case, training is a powerful tool. In this case, if we implement hazard perception in the training that we provide to drivers, then we could reduce the risk of collisions. I'm not going to go through the details of the other root causes. I just wanted to mention the first three because two out of these three are main targets for our projects during this year and probably for the next years too. So when we started working with TRL, we were also parallelly working in some changes within UNHCR. As I mentioned, we were facing some barriers, but then we started using the reports for supporting some of these initiatives. One of them was the stopping the provision of boulevards. We tried to start this fight since 2021, but once we got some information saying, yes, within UNHCR operations, boulevards are a risk of fatal collisions and injury collisions, there wasn't any point of discussion. We just take action and stop the provision of boulevards from the headquarters. Other things that we were doing, we were working on strengthening our regulations, but I still was facing some reluctance to do changes. However, once we had a report saying, yes, it is very important that you improve your regulations, then it was easier to explain or justify some of the changes. Some changes that I started working on, people were still hesitating and when they were arguing against them, but once I presented the information, then it was very easy to get acceptance of those changes in relation to corrective actions to drivers, in relation to rules for partner organization drivers. And if I put in here an example, the speed management in Uganda. Before TRL, we started working with the team of Uganda too. And we, among the interventions, we were strengthening the regulations over the drivers there, and we were implementing some better speed management techniques there. However, we didn't have evidence supporting it. But once we got the report, then it was very clear that we were in the correct track with Uganda. Now there is not room for questioning what we are doing there. And then this is very important. As Craig mentioned, most of our traffic crashes are in these two regions, East and Horn Africa and Great Lakes, and West Central Africa regions. For this year, I had an idea of conducting some analysis for creating road safety strategies for individual countries, which was going to be very time-consuming. But I was discussing with my boss, and my boss said, okay, well, you can use the report and check what are the things that we already know, and then try to focus these strategies on trying to find other problems within the road safety management system, I mean. And then it was very clear, when I did that, it was very clear for me. We have these two regions where we have most of the traffic crashes, over 85% of the traffic crashes, as far as I remember. Crashes with injuries and fatalities and total losses, I mean. And then the comparison was quite interesting, because we have in the east corner of Africa and Great Lakes, the main problem is related to inappropriate exceeding posted speed limits. And that is the second problem in West Central Africa region. And then the third problem for both regions is hazard perception. So I talked with my boss. I think it's better if we focus on these two first, and we allocate more resources in exceeding the speed limits and in improving hazard perception skills, than conducting the analysis that is going to give us individual problems for each country. Because, as I mentioned, we were working with Uganda, and when Uganda was the first country in which we conducted an analysis to create a road safety strategy for that operation. We came up with more than 20 recommended actions. From those 20, they selected about 5 or 6 of them. And among them, they have training in which we can implement hazard perception, and they have speed management too. The other ones, it's not that they are not important. The other recommendations, it's not that they are not important, but they might not have capacity for managing the rest of the actions that we recommended. And I said to my boss, I'm afraid that if we do this job of analyzing the individual operations and try to identify problems individually, we are going to find the same issue, that they might not have capacity for implementing the rest of the recommendations. So it's better if we focus first on these two elements, the speed management and poor hazard perception, because we have more control over this. And after implementing this, we re-evaluate and we assess the results, and then we try to tune better the efforts on road safety. But it's quite clear that the priorities in these two regions will be speed management and improving hazard perception skills. And then we are going to see how doing these two actions is going to help reducing the risk of traffic crashes, and to quantify how much this risk was reduced. So, as I was mentioning, the impact of this report helped us to prioritize some of the projects that we had in mind. So we are still in the process of strengthening our regulations, but now we have evidence that supports these changes. We are focusing on speed management, as we did in Uganda. We are going to use the VTS, the vehicle tracking system, for controlling better speeds in other regions. And we are trying to test some new technologies. I started working on the proposal of a safer partner program. So we are going to work closely with partner organizations in reducing the risk of traffic crashes. As I already mentioned, also, there is one initiative of the inclusion of partner organizations in carpooling schemes. And I managed to convince the colleague who is in charge of this. I managed to convince this colleague to include also road safety in this process. So this is going to occur after the second quarter of this year. We are going to approach the organization who is organizing the carpooling scheme there in Tanzania in this case, and include the road safety component in this project. And then we are assessing different options for improving hazard perception. Concluding remarks, strong information is a powerful tool for getting support on initiatives for improving road safety and for prioritizing them. Despite there is not a single recipe for solving traffic crash problems, we identified some common problems among some of the main regions. The Hagal is Central, is Horn Africa, Great Lakes, and West Central Africa region. So implementing solutions to those common problems helps accelerating the process for reducing the risk of traffic crashes. Thank you so much for your attention to this presentation. Do you have any question?
Thank you very much, Carlos. Yes, we will quickly run through some questions, and that's been Craig back as well. We've got about 5 minutes, gentlemen, so quick fire questions for you, because I've been noting some down and some have been coming into the Q&A section as well. Craig, first of all, can I just talk about kind of what's in it for people watching this? You know, if you're operating a large fleet and maybe looking at reducing the number of collisions involving your vehicles, how can investigations that we've been learning about in the last 45 minutes or so actually help? And can't they just be done internally?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, they can help, absolutely. I think the main point here is investigations only help you define your problem. So if we carry out an investigation, it will help you understand as a fleet operator or a driver even exactly how that collision occurred. It won't necessarily solve it and stop it from happening again. So I think that's where essentially I guess it comes down to skill set. Do you have the skill set internally in your organization to do that? And as time moves on, you know, digital data is becoming even bigger. Are organizations going to have the skills to carry out detailed analysis of telematics data, of video analysis, or actually do they need to just focus on getting on with business and doing what it is they do best and actually bring in the skills of other people, which I think is kind of what UNHCR identified, but equally that would apply to any other operator of fleets as well.
Okay, and just on the data point, one of the things I wanted to pick up is you said sometimes there are challenges in getting data from these incidents, either not being able to pick it up or not being able to get there to look at it. Are there cases when you haven't had enough information to carry out an investigation? And if that's the case, what did you do?
Yeah, there's been multiple. I guess you have to do with the best you can. If you don't get information, we invariably have to try and model scenarios based on what limited information we have. It's not the most reliable way to do it. Ideally, you want to have really good quality information that can allow us to test various scenarios. often it's difficult, certainly in UNHCR's operating environment, to get that information from people on the ground. But there's an element of, I guess, education, and that's what we're working with them now to try and do, is to educate the people in operations to say, okay, there's been a crash. What kind of stuff should I collect? Often a photograph, people just take one photograph, but we're interested in what happened 100, 200 meters down the road. We're not necessarily interested in what happened right where the cars came to rest. So I guess it's that capacity building, capability building that really helps do that, because it can be difficult.
Okay, right. Quick fire answers from both of you now as I rattle through the last few in the last 3 minutes of the webinar. So, Carlos, you talked about main root cause 24% of crashes being speed related. How could UNHCR improve speed controls?
Well, that's an interesting question because, as I mentioned, training is not the solution for speeding problems, is part of it. So first, we are through the process of improving our regulations, and that is also related to speed management. One of the changes that was implemented this year was a change on the administrative instruction on safe driving bonus, because the drivers can get a bonus at the end of the year if they behave according to certain standards. But the previous bonus didn't take into consideration key elements of drivers' behaviors, such as speed, such as seatbelt utilization. It was mostly about behaving properly, yes, but they didn't define it clearly. And it was mostly about reporting crashes when they occur, because back at the time when they came up with this AI administrative instruction, one of the problems is that people were not reporting traffic crashes.
Right.
But then we changed this AI in order to include the speeding and other drivers' behaviors in the eligibility criteria.
Okay.
Then we are also aiming to implement some rules for driving vehicles in which we go to a higher level of detail on the safest speeds, especially when it comes to interacting with pedestrians and cyclists. If somebody is driving in an area where there is a lot of interactions with pedestrians and cyclists, our regulation is saying you should drive at 30 kilometers per hour in those areas. But then this, again, we can communicate this to drivers, and it's going to be an option for the driver basically to obey this or not. But when we mix this with the configuration of the vehicle tracking system,
Okay. Right.
then we can monitor if somebody is really complying with these regulations or the country regulations, or if they are not doing it. And if they are not doing it, then we apply some corrective actions. It could be that we reward those drivers who really complied with the speed limits, and that's why we changed the AI on bonus. But on the other hand, and this is another regulation we are working on, if somebody is constantly breaking the rules for using our vehicles, despite we give the opportunity, because the proposal is that we approach the driver and we say, okay, colleague, you are presenting this issue, so please pay attention, try to correct it, otherwise we could apply some corrective actions. If the
Okay.
driver
Right.
still continues with that, then we proceed with the application of corrective actions. And we are looking for similar mechanisms for partner drivers too.
Okay, I want very quickly one more question, because I want to come back to Craig for two more. But very quickly, when you do the results of you get the results of the investigations, are they included in drivers' training sessions?
Yes, we have done that with one of the suppliers who has been hired for providing defensive driving training in some operations. So we have shared with them some of the reports, and then based on the reports, they adapt the lessons to tackle specific issues during the training sessions. So yeah, we have done that.
Excellent. Right. Thank you, Craig. Very quickly, a couple of questions from the audience. Where do you get your telematics data from? And what's the quality of the medical information that you get back from these countries?
Yeah, so on the telematics front, that's from a system that is fitted to all UNHCR vehicles. We get quite detailed information, but it's not necessarily high resolution. So we get location, speed, various other different inputs. Speed and location is generally what we're most interested in, but it's not very high resolution is the challenge. On the medical information question, I would say it varies. Some countries are better than others. Some are quite poor, and we get very little in terms of medical information. It really does vary because UNHCR operates in 110 different countries. As you can imagine, some are really good and some are not so good.
Okay, right. Well, look, unfortunately, we could carry on for ages on this one. We're out of time. Now, if you've asked a question or you've got more questions, my suggestion will be link in with Carlos and Craig, send them a LinkedIn request. They'll be delighted to answer more of your questions and interact with you online. But for now, as I say, we're out of time. So all I'll say is thank you very much for your participation today in joining this webinar, and to our guests, Craig Arnold, TRL's UN Technical Lead, and Carlos Güemes-Shedden, Senior Road Safety Coordinator from the UNHCR's Road Safety Unit. We will join you for another TRL webinar in a few weeks' time. But for now, thanks for watching and have a good rest of the day.